You pull down the attic hatch of a pre-1940 home and assume it's just storage. Boxes, maybe some old furniture, probably nothing. But these attics weren't passive spaces. They were designed, filled, used, and then sealed. What's still up there isn't just old. Some of it was never safe. Some of it was cutting edge for its decade. And some of it is still actively affecting the house below right now, whether anyone knows it or not. One thing up there was installed as a feature. That's where this gets interesting. The first thing to understand about a pre-1940 attic is what it was actually supposed to do. It wasn't storage. That came later, when people started treating it like an extra closet and shoving holiday decorations through the hatch. The original design logic was environmental. The attic was a thermal buffer, a layer of unconditioned airspace between the roof and the living floors below. No insulation in the roof deck, open ventilation at the eaves and ridge, and a deliberate gap that let heat rise, circulate, and escape. In summer, the attic pulled hot air away from the rooms below. In winter, the cold stayed up there, and the heat stayed down here. It was passive climate management, and in the era before central heating, it worked reasonably well. Then central heating arrived. Then insulation became a product you could buy and install. Then contractors started sealing things, blocking vents, packing insulation between joists, closing off the airflow that the original design depended on. The attic that was built to breathe got suffocated. The thermal logic that required air movement got replaced with materials that required the opposite. Moisture that used to escape through ventilation had nowhere to go. It started accumulating in the framing, in the sheathing, in whatever insulation had been packed in. The system was designed for a house that central heating fundamentally changed, and nobody stopped to ask whether the attic's original logic still applied. What you inherit when you buy a pre-1940 home is often an attic that was sealed mid-system, partially vented, partially blocked. Original framing that was designed for airflow, now surrounded by materials that restrict it. The consequence isn't dramatic. It's slow, a damp smell that never fully goes away, a ceiling that feels slightly colder than it should, a moisture reading that makes the inspector pause. The attic was designed for a house that no longer exists. It just didn't know that yet. And then there's the wiring. If you open a pre-1940 attic floor and start tracing what's running along the joists, there's a reasonable chance you'll find knob and tube. Ceramic knobs mounted to the wood, holding the wire clear of the framing. Ceramic tubes threaded through the joists, where the wire passed through. It was the standard residential wiring system from roughly the 1880s through the early 1940s, and it was designed with genuine engineering logic. The open-air installation wasn't careless. It was intentional. The wire generated heat under load, and the air around it was supposed to carry that heat away. The system needed to breathe. The problem came later, decades later, when well-meaning homeowners and contractors decided the attic needed better insulation. They blew in cellulose. They rolled out fiberglass bats. They packed the insulation right up to the framing and right around the wiring, because that's where the insulation needed to go. Nobody thought about the knob and tube still running through it. The insulation that was supposed to make the house more efficient wrapped itself around wiring that had been designed to stay cool in open air and turned it into a fire risk. The wire didn't change, the conditions around it did. If you call an inspector to a pre-1940 home and there's knob and tube in the attic, you will see the clipboard slow down. Insurers treat it as a liability. Some refuse to write policies at all. Some charge enough that the annual premium becomes its own budget line. Remediation means pulling out the old wiring and running new, which means opening ceilings and walls and floors to trace where the runs go. Contractors find it under 3 layers of insulation, added in different decades, each layer added by someone who had no idea what was underneath. The wire was fine. The good intentions that buried it were the problem. If you want to subscribe, do it now. What's coming next is worse. Now let's talk about what was used as insulation before the modern products existed, because this is where the attic becomes something you do not want to casually poke around in. Pre-1940 builders used what was available: wood shavings, horsehair, newspaper slag wool, an early mineral wool product made from industrial byproduct. All of these were sold in catalogs as insulation solutions. All of them were marketed with the confidence of the era. Wood shavings and newspaper compressed over time, lost their insulating value, attracted pests, and introduced the kind of organic material that does very specific things in a damp environment. Slag wool was friable and loose, the kind of material that became airborne if disturbed, and in some formulations later became associated with respiratory concerns. But the entry in this category that has the longest practical consequence is vermiculite. Vermiculite is a natural mineral that expands when heated. It's lightweight, pourable, and has decent insulating properties. From the 1920s through roughly the 1980s, It was widely used as blown-in attic insulation. You've seen it if you've been in enough old attics. Small gray-brown pebbles, loose across the attic floor, sometimes a few inches deep, sometimes covering the entire space. It looks like gravel. It behaves like gravel. The problem is that the majority of vermiculite sold in the United States during that period came from a single mine in Libby, Montana, and that mine had a contamination problem. The ore body ran through a deposit of asbestos. The vermiculite that came out of Libby carried asbestos with it, and the vermiculite that went into attics across the country carried it too. Undisturbed, vermiculite insulation is considered low risk. The fibers don't go anywhere if the materials is left alone. But the moment you start moving it, shoveling it out for an insulation upgrade, drilling through the floor below it to run a new wire, cutting into the ceiling for a recessed light, the disturbance sends material into the air. Testing requires a certified professional. Removal requires hazmat protocol. The estimate for a typical attic runs into thousands of dollars before the new insulation goes in. The material looked like gravel. The difference only mattered when someone touched it. One more thing before this chapter closes, and it lives right in the middle of the attic: the chimney. Pre-1940 homes were heated by fire, coal, wood, and later gas, and the flue that served those fireplaces ran straight up through the house and through the attic to exit at the roof. The chimney was structural. It was central. It was the reason the house stayed warm before central heating existed. When central heating replaced the fireplace, the standard solution was to seal the hearth at the bottom. Cap the opening, tile over it, maybe convert it to decorative use. What did not happen in many cases was properly sealing the top of the flue at the roofline. The chimney stack continued running through the attic, doing nothing. Sealed at the bottom and open at the top, inviting moisture every time it rained and wildlife every time something needed a place to nest. The masonry aged without the thermal cycling of an active fire to keep it stable. Mortar joints deteriorated. Bricks shifted. Contractors who open attics describe finding chimney flues that have been collecting squirrels and standing water for 40 years, with the masonry in advanced stages of deterioration, and the cost to properly address the situation tied directly to how much of the structure the stack touches. The fireplace was sealed. The problem it left in the ceiling was not. Everything in Chapter 1 ended up in the attic by neglect, by changing standards, by decisions made somewhere else that nobody thought to undo. What comes in Chapter 2 is different. These were installations. Deliberate. Sold to homeowners as upgrades. Proof that the house was current. The things you find by accident are concerning. The things that were put there on purpose are where it gets strange. The energy crisis of the 1970s made a lot of people do a lot of things to old houses. Fuel prices spiked, heating bills followed, and the government encouraged homeowners to retrofit insulation into existing structures as quickly and cheaply as possible. For pre-1940 homes with inadequate or non-existent insulation, that meant finding a way to add material without tearing walls apart. The answer the industry offered was urea formaldehyde foam. The pitch was straightforward. Contractors would drill small holes in your exterior walls, inject the foam, and the material would expand to fill the cavity. No demolition, no drywall. A weekend job that would cut your heating bill for decades. Advertisements called it a modern solution for older homes. Building supply catalogs promoted it alongside storm windows and weather stripping as the responsible upgrade for the energy-conscious homeowner. If your house was drafty and expensive to heat, this was the answer. The foam worked in the narrow sense. It filled cavities, it reduced air infiltration. But urea formaldehyde is not a stable material at room temperature. It off-gases formaldehyde, a chemical that at elevated concentrations causes eye and respiratory irritation, and at prolonged exposures became associated with more serious health concerns. Homeowners who had the foam injected began reporting symptoms. A headache that didn't go away, eyes that watered indoors, a smell that faded slowly over months but never entirely disappeared. The material that was supposed to make the house more comfortable was making the air inside it worse. In 1982, the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned urea formaldehyde foam for residential use. The ban was later overturned on procedural grounds, but by that point the product had effectively disappeared from the market. What did not disappear was the foam already inside millions of walls and attics. It had been injected into the cavities of pre-1940 homes across the country during the retrofit boom, and removing it requires opening the walls it was injected into, which costs considerably more than the original installation. Over time, the material becomes brittle and crumbles. It doesn't go back to being harmless. It just becomes a different kind of problem. You can test for it. You probably won't like the result. The energy upgrade aged out of fashion, then aged out of safety standards, then stayed in the walls anyway. We need to talk about mid-century cooling, because the attic was also where the pre-air-conditioning era stored its best idea, the whole house fan. If you've been in enough pre-1940 homes, you've seen the evidence. A large louvered panel set into a hallway ceiling, sometimes covered with a board, sometimes painted over, sometimes just sitting there looking like it belongs to a house that no longer needs it. The panel is the bottom of a whole house fan installation, and the fan itself is still in the attic above it. The logic was excellent. On a hot evening, you opened the windows, switched on the fan, and it pulled cool outside air through every room in the house and exhausted the accumulated heat through the attic vents. No refrigerant, no compressor. A direct exchange of hot interior air for cool night air, moving at high volume. In the era before affordable central air conditioning, this was the premium cooling solution for a family home. Catalogs in the 1940s and 1950s sold them with enthusiasm. Builders installed them as standard features in houses designed for warm climates. Then central air became affordable, and the whole house fan became redundant. The standard response was to disconnect it and leave it in place. The louvered panel in the ceiling got a piece of plywood laid over it. The fan housing sat in the attic, still bolted to the framing, still occupying a large section of the attic floor, connected to nothing and sealing nothing. Here's the part that keeps showing up on energy audits. The opening that the whole house fan used was sized for maximum airflow. That was the point. And an opening sized for maximum airflow does not stop moving air simply because the fan was turned off. The gap around an abandoned whole house fan installation, between the housing and the framing, through the louvered panel below, around the plywood cover, acts as a direct conduit between the living space and the attic. In winter, warm conditioned air rises through it continuously. In summer, attic heat pushes back down through it. Energy auditors who find these installations describe them as some of the worst thermal bypasses in older homes. The unit is large, awkward, and structural enough that removal is a project in itself. Most contractors factor it as a separate line item. It stopped working in 1967. It has been costing money every month since. This is the part of the channel that rewards people who stay. If you're still here, subscribe. The next reveal is the one contractors don't warn you about until they're already inside. Then there is the paint. This one is not specific to a single decade or a single product. It is a condition of the era, which means it applies to nearly every pre-1940 attic without exception. Lead-based paint was the standard for residential use. Interior and exterior, finished surfaces and rough framing, trim and structural members and everything in between. It was durable, it adhered well, it resisted moisture better than the alternatives. In a space like an attic, where rough framing was exposed and the conditions were harsh, lead paint went on the joists and the rafters and the collar ties as a matter of standard practice. Lead-based paint was banned for residential use in the United States in 1978. In a pre-1940 home, that ban arrived roughly 40 years after the framing was painted. The paint had been up there for 4 decades by the time anyone decided it was a problem. And in an attic, paint does something that it doesn't do as readily on interior walls. It cycles. The attic swings between extreme heat in summer and near freezing temperatures in winter, and that thermal cycling causes the paint to expand and contract over and over. It chalks. It flakes. It produces fine particles that settle on the attic floor, on the insulation, on whatever is up there. When you hire a contractor to work in the attic of a pre-1940 home to remove insulation, to run new wiring, to install HVAC equipment, to modify the framing, the lead paint on the structural members becomes a disclosure issue. It triggers testing requirements. It can require certified abatement before other trades can proceed. It adds cost that wasn't in the original quote, timeline that wasn't in the original schedule, and conversations that nobody was prepared to have when they pulled the permit. It explains why experienced contractors bidding pre-1940 attic work always pad the number before they've seen inside. They've been in these attics before. They know what the framing looks like. They know what color that old paint is. Lead paint in an attic doesn't behave like lead paint on a living room wall. On a living room wall, it's covered, primed over, painted over, buried under 3 or 4 subsequent layers applied across different decades by different owners, who had different taste in colors, but the same indifference to what was underneath. In that condition, it sits quietly. You can test for it, find it, document it, and in many cases leave it alone as long as the surface is intact. The guidance for intact lead paint in good condition is often to encapsulate rather than remove, seal it, cover it, leave it undisturbed. The attic doesn't give you that option. The attic is exposed framing, raw joists, collar ties, rafters, the underside of the roof sheathing. None of it was ever finished, because finishing it wasn't the point. The paint went on as a protective coating for the wood, not as a decorative surface for the room. And because it was never covered, It has been cycling directly against the attic environment for a century. Summer temperatures in an unventilated attic can exceed 130 degrees. Winter temperatures in a cold climate attic can drop below freezing. That range, repeated every single year, expands and contracts the paint film against the wood grain beneath it. Eventually, the adhesion fails. The paint chalks. It flakes. It produces fine particles that fall through the attic's insulation, that settle on surfaces, that become part of the ambient dust in the space. When you bring a contractor into that environment to do work, any work, the lead paint on the structural members is not a background condition. It is an active concern. Federal law requires contractors to follow specific work practices when disturbing lead-based paint in pre-1978 housing. The EPA's renovation, repair, and painting rule applies to any work that disturbs more than 6 square feet of lead-painted surface. Space. In an attic where the joists and rafters are coated, basic renovation activities, cutting into the framing, drilling for wire runs, installing blocking for HVAC equipment, will almost certainly cross that threshold. That means containment. That means personal protective equipment. That means specific cleaning protocols and waste disposal requirements. That means the contractor's crew cannot simply work through the space the way they would in a newer house. It also means testing if the paint status is unknown. A certified inspector or risk assessor has to sample the surfaces. The samples go to a lab. The results determine the scope of the abatement protocol. If the paint is in poor condition, flaking, chalking, deteriorating, the abatement work may have to happen before any other trade enters the space. The electrician waits. The insulation crew waits. The HVAC installer waits. Every hour of waiting is an hour on the project timeline, and every hour on the timeline is money the owner wasn't expected to spend when they decided to finish the attic. This is why the contractor's bid looks high before they've even opened the hatch. They're pricing what they know is likely to be there, because they've been in enough of these attics to know what pre-1940 framing looks like when you get a flashlight on it. The framing is fine. The paint on the framing is the conversation nobody wanted to have. And then there's what the attic actually was. Not what it became after decades of neglect. Not what it looks like now, with its loose insulation and its abandoned fan and its century-old wiring. What it was originally, when the house was new and the family that built it was living in it for the first time. In a significant number of pre-1940 working-class and middle-class homes, the attic wasn't storage space. It was finished space. Real rooms, with real walls, with real people living in them, accessed by a proper staircase, not a pull-down hatch, not a ship's ladder, but a full staircase that connected the attic floor to the floor below it. The rooms under the roofline served different purposes in different households. In larger homes that employed domestic staff, the attic held the servants' quarters, the cook's room, the housekeeper's room, the room for whoever lived in the house to work rather than to own it. In smaller homes without staff, the attic held children's bedrooms, because children didn't need much space and the space under the roof's what was available. In houses where the family needed income, the attic rooms were rented to boarders, a common arrangement in early 20th century urban neighborhoods, where every square foot of a modest house had to justify itself financially. The attic, in other words, was where the household put the people it needed to house, but didn't have room for on the main floors. It was practical, it was dense, it was used constantly, and it was built to the standards of its era, which means it was built to no standards that currently exist. The staircase that led to these rooms was built to the tolerances of 1922, or 1915, or 1908, depending on when the house went up. The rise between steps is too steep by modern code. The tread depth is too short. The headroom clearance where the stair turns under the roofline doesn't meet the minimum required for egress. You've probably been in one of these staircases in an old house and noticed it. The way you instinctively lean forward going up, the way you angle your foot on the narrow treads, the way the ceiling comes down towards you at the top. That's not charming quirk. That's a pre-code staircase doing exactly what pre-code staircases do. The windows in these rooms, where they existed at all, were sized for light and cross ventilation. Dormers with single-hung windows, or small fixed panes set into the gable end, not sized for a person to climb through. Not positioned for easy access to a roof section that would allow escape. Modern egress requirements for a sleeping room specify minimum opening dimensions and maximum sill height from the floor. Because the window is not just a window, it's an emergency exit. The windows in a pre-1940 attic room were never designed as emergency exits. They were designed as windows. The ceiling height in the usable portions of base, the center section under the ridge, might meet current minimums for occupied space. The ceiling height in the sections where the rafters slope down toward the eaves does not, And in a typical pre-1940 attic room, those sloped sections account for a substantial portion of the floor area. The room feels larger than it is because you're measuring floor area, and the floor area includes zones where an adult cannot stand upright. The wiring serving the space is whatever was standard when the house was built, which means knob and tube if it hasn't been touched, or a partial update that mixed knob and tube with mid-century wiring in ways that inspectors find professionally distressing. The insulation in the walls and the knee wall spaces is non-existent, or it's whatever was added later, which in pre-1940 homes often means the vermiculite or the urea formaldehyde foam. The space that once held a family's live-in housekeeper is now a space that fails every modern habitability standard simultaneously and will need to be substantially rebuilt before a building department will issue a certificate of occupancy for it. When owners of pre-1940 homes decide they want to finish or refinish the attic, to add a bedroom for a growing family, to create a home office, to convert unused square footage into something that adds value at resale, the contractor estimates they receive are rarely what they were expecting. The scope is not a renovation. The scope is closer to a reconstruction. Fire-rated drywall on the sloping sections and the knee walls. Egress windows, which means either cutting through the roof for dormers or enlarging existing openings to meet the dimensional requirements, both of which are structural projects with roofing implications. The staircase, if it doesn't meet current code, has to be rebuilt. New dimensions, new handrail geometry, sometimes relocated entirely if the existing stair doesn't have adequate headroom. Full electrical replacement because the knob and tube can't remain active under new insulation and can't be grandfathered into an occupied space under most current codes. Insulation installation, preceded by whatever testing and remediation the original attic contents require, which, as already established, may involve asbestos-contaminated vermiculite, lead paint abatement, and the removal of materials that require certified disposal. The project cost for converting a pre-1940 attic into a legal, code-compliant, insurable bedroom in a major American city routinely exceeds 6 figures before a single finished material has been selected. Before the flooring goes in, before the trim is painted, before the closet is built, the structural and safety work alone, the egress windows, the stair, the electrical, the insulation, the abatement, often costs more than the original construction of the entire house adjusted for inflation. It was a bedroom in 1928. Turning it back into a bedroom in 2024 costs more than the house did in 1928. None of this happened because the people who built these homes were reckless or incompetent. The framing went up correctly, with the lumber and the joinery and the craftsmanship of the era. The wiring was installed to the standard of its decade by electricians who were doing their jobs properly. The insulation was the product the catalog recommended, purchased from a reputable supplier, applied by someone who believed they were improving the house. The paint was what the supply house stocked because it was what everyone used. The fan was a genuine innovation that made summer bearable for families who had no other option. The foam was a government-encouraged retrofit during an energy crisis. Every single decision made inside that attic sent the person baking it in the year they made it, with the information they had access to at the time. What changed was the information. Safety codes arrived that didn't exist when the house was built. Chemical testing methods developed that hadn't been invented yet. Materials that had never been formally evaluated turned out to require evaluation. Systems that seemed durable turned out to have failure modes that nobody had modeled because nobody had thought to model them. Standards were revised, updated, and revised again, each cycle responding to something that the previous cycle had missed. The attic didn't change at all. It sat there, in the dark, with everything exactly where it had been placed. The understanding of what was in it changed decade by decade, one revised code cycle at a time. You buy a pre-1940 home, and you are buying the structure and the full century that lived inside it. The street-facing facade can look immaculate. The original woodwork can be intact. The plaster walls can be solid. The rooms can feel warm and substantial, and full of the kind of character that newer construction genuinely cannot replicate. All of that is real. And the attic holds the record of everything the house was asked to do, everything the era assumed was permanent, and everything that later turned out to require correction. It holds it quietly, in insulation that hasn't been touched in 80 years. In wiring that still runs to outlets on the floor below, in paint that flakes and the temperature swings and settles into the insulation beneath it, in a fan housing that nobody ever got around to removing because removal was never urgent enough to schedule, and now it sits in the attic of a house that has had 4 owners since the fan last turned. The history of how we build things is mostly the history of what we got wrong and eventually fixed. Every code change is the residue of a previous mistake. Every banned material was once the recommended material. Every contractor warning story was once a standard installation. The attic is where that history accumulates most honestly, because nobody decorates it, and nobody shows it to guests, and nobody thinks about it until something goes wrong or someone decides to renovate. It doesn't perform for anyone, it just holds what was put there. If your house is still looking this good, make sure you're subscribed. The next video goes deeper into what your walls are actually made of. The house kept its history in the one room you never thought to check.